The twin sisters, one born of flesh, one born of darkness. What if I told you that two twin sisters could share the same womb, the same mother, the same moment of birth, but belong to entirely different worlds? One, a daughter of man, the other, a daughter of the devil himself. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't a myth passed down through generations to scare children into behaving. This is a true story, a dark, blood-soaked tale from Indonesia that has haunted an entire village for decades. And if you think you've heard every horror story there is, trust me when I say this one will crawl under your skin and stay there. Before we descend into this nightmare together, make sure you're subscribed. Some stories are too terrifying to face alone, and if you vanish before the end, well, let's just say you've been warned. Let me take you back to where it all began, to a night that would forever change an entire village. The year was 1976. The place was a small, forgotten village called Semarang in Indonesia, a place where the nights were darker, the shadows longer, and silence carried a weight that pressed against your chest like a physical burden. It was a village that learned, the hard way, that some doors should never be opened, and some bargains should never be made. On this particular evening, a group of young children were playing in the fields. They had fashioned a crude ball out of corn husks. Because real footballs were rare luxuries in this impoverished village. They laughed, they ran, their bare feet slapping against the damp earth, unaware that twilight was creeping in faster than they realized. The sun had begun its slow death behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deepening purple. Among these children were two best friends, Abdi and Tris. They were inseparable, the kind of friends who shared everything from secrets to scraps of food. As the other children began to scatter and hurry home at the call of their parents, Abdi and Tris lingered. They were determined to retrieve their precious homemade ball, which had been kicked too far into the tall crops. The cornfield swallowed them whole. The stalks stood tall and dense, forming walls of green that blocked out the fading light. By the time they found the ball, the sun had already drowned beneath the horizon. Darkness was falling like a heavy blanket, suffocating the last remnants of daylight. That's when they heard it. At first, it sounded like a whisper, a soft, melodic calling of their names that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then came the sound of someone crying, sobbing somewhere in the distance, yet impossibly close. Abdi felt the blood drain from his face. His legs trembled beneath him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, to abandon everything and get as far away from this cursed field as possible. But Tris was braver, or perhaps more foolish. He pushed forward, following the ghostly voice, ignoring Abby's desperate pleas to turn back. And then, suddenly, she appeared. A young girl. Half her head was bald, the other half covered in wild, matted hair. Her skin was pale, too pale, almost translucent, and in her thin, trembling hand, she held her ball. Abdi's heart nearly stopped. He could see that this was no ordinary child. Something was deeply, terrifyingly wrong. But Tris, poor Tris, didn't see the danger until it was too late. He stepped closer, reaching for the ball with the innocent trust of a child who had never learned that monsters could wear human faces. What happened next would haunt Abdi for the rest of his life. In a flash of inhuman speed, the girl transformed. No longer was she a pathetic, crying child. She became something else. Something ancient and evil and hungry. Her hands moved like blurs, tearing into Tris's body with a violence that no human child could possess. The sound of ripping flesh and breaking bones echoed through the silent field. Blood sprayed across the cornstalks, painting them dark and glistening in the moonlight. Abdi ran. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out beneath him. He ran all the way home, bursting through the door with tears streaming down his face, gasping for breath as he told his father what he had witnessed. The village mobilized. Men armed with torches and crude weapons rushed to the field, but all they found was blood. So much blood. And by the riverbank, lying cold and broken on the jagged rocks, was Tris's small, lifeless body. But this tragedy was merely the beginning, because you see, the horror that claimed Tris's life had a name that would become whispered in fear throughout the entire region for generations to come. Her name was Suma. Now, to understand how a creature like Suma came to exist, we must travel back in time. Back 29 years before that fateful night in the cornfield. Back to 1947, when a wealthy couple lived in this very village, a man named Simon and his beautiful, gentle wife, Sulastri. On the surface, they seemed to have everything: wealth, status, a grand house that towered over the humble dwellings of their neighbors. But there was one thing they lacked, one thing that Simon obsessively demanded: an heir, a child, someone to carry on his name and inherit his land. For 11 long years they tried, 11 years of hope and disappointment, of prayers whispered in the dark and offerings made to gods who seemed deaf to their pleas. And with each passing year, Zeman grew colder, crueler, more desperate. You see, Zeman himself had been born with a physical deformity, a twisted foot that made him limp. He had suffered greatly as a child because of it, mocked and shunned by his peers. The trauma had carved a deep, jagged scar into his soul, and that scar had hardened into something ugly, an obsession with having a perfect, healthy child. His uncle, a greedy man who coveted Zeman's land, tormented him relentlessly. 11 years, he would sneer, and still no child? A wife like Sulastri should have given you at least 8 children by now. When you die without an heir, all this land becomes mine. The words cut deeper than any knife, wounding Zeman's pride again and again. Sulastri suffered the most. She was a woman of incredible patience and devotion, raised to believe that a wife's duty was to serve her husband in all things. But she could not give him what he wanted most, and for that, he made her pay. He would rage at her for the smallest infractions, accuse her of being barren, threaten to take another wife, a younger, more fertile woman who could give him the children she could not. The pressure was crushing her. She began to spend hours crying alone in the corners of their vast, empty house, her tears falling on floors that echoed with loneliness. One afternoon, as she sat outside the kitchen, trying to hide her sobs from the household staff, she overheard 2 workers talking about a mysterious old woman named Tukina. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about how this woman had helped countless families conceive children when all hope seemed lost. They spoke of miracles, of babies born to women who had been told they would never be mothers. For Sulastri, it was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had consumed her life. That very evening, accompanied by her loyal servant Kolsum, she made the journey to find Tukina. They had to cross a river to reach the old woman's dwelling, the water dark and foreboding under the fading light. When they finally arrived, they found themselves in a place that seemed to exist between worlds, a small, ramshackle hut that smelled of strange herbs and ancient decay. Tukina was not what Sulastri expected. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes milky with age, but sharp with an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. She didn't ask why Sulastri had come. She already knew. "I can help you," the old woman croaked, her voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "But my help comes from a source that most would consider forbidden. My master is not of this world. My master is Iblis, the devil himself." Sulastri's blood ran cold. She should have turned around. She should have run back to the river, back to her home, back to her husband's cruelty. But desperation is a powerful drug, and she was an addict, desperate for her fix. "What must I do?" she whispered. Tukina smiled, revealing a mouth full of yellowed, rotting teeth. "A ritual," she said. "A pact. You will become pregnant with twins, but not the twins you imagine. One child will be the daughter of your husband. The other will be the daughter of Iblis himself. The second child will be deformed, weak, monstrous to look upon. But you must care for her. You must raise her with love for 10 years. And on her 10th birthday, her true father will come to claim what is his." The conditions were impossible, cruel, designed to break the strongest of souls. But Sulastri didn't care. She heard only one thing: she would have children. She would finally be the mother her husband demanded she be. The ritual that followed was unspeakable. Tukina made Sulastri drink a mixture of blood and unnamable substances, and as the liquid slid down her throat, Sulastri felt something invade her body, something cold and malevolent that settled deep in her womb. She convulsed on the floor, her belly swelling and contracting in unnatural waves, until finally, mercifully, she passed out. When she woke, Tukina was leaning over her with a satisfied expression. 2 months, the old woman said. "You will know you are pregnant within 2 months. And she was right. The pregnancy progressed with an alarming speed. Sulastri's belly grew round and heavy far faster than any normal pregnancy should allow. And there was something else. Strange dreams plagued her sleep. Dreams of a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching, waiting, its eyes burning like coals in the darkness. Zeman, oblivious to the dark bargain his wife had made, was overjoyed. He strutted around the village like a rooster, boasting about his virility, about how he had known all along that he could father children. He even threw a grand celebration of feast that the entire village attended, where he announced to anyone who would listen that the Zeman bloodline would continue. He chose names for his children. The first would be Kumala, the second, Suma. But nature and the supernatural have a way of collecting their debts. The night of the birth arrived during a violent thunderstorm. Rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 angry fists, and lightning split the sky with blinding flashes. Sulastri's screams echoed through the house as she labored, and Zeman paced outside the door, his limp making his gait awkward and frantic. Inside, the midwife and Kolsum worked frantically. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The first child emerged, but she was not breathing. A tiny, still form that the midwife quickly wrapped and set aside, not wanting to alarm the mother unnecessarily. But then, moments later, Sulastri's eyes snapped open, and she saw something that froze the scream in her throat. There, sitting calmly on the sofa in her room, was a figure, dark, massive, with eyes that burned red in the dim light. Iblis, the devil himself. He sat and watched as Sulastri pushed the second child into the world. This baby, the child of darkness, drew her first breath with a wet, rattling gasp that made the midwife recoil in horror. The child was deformed beyond description. Her skin was mottled and gray, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles, her face a grotesque mask that barely looked human. Zeman burst into the room at the sound of the second child's cry, drunk on joy and anticipation. But when he saw the thing that was supposedly his daughter, something inside him snapped. All the trauma of his own childhood, all the mockery and shame he had endured for his twisted foot, came rushing back with redoubled force. He had sworn he would never have a child like himself, a child who would suffer as he had suffered. And now, looking at this monstrous creature, this abomination that nature had inflicted upon him, he felt something far uglier than disappointment. He felt hate. Without thinking, without pausing for even a moment, Zeman grabbed a knife from a nearby table. Sulastri screamed for him to stop, begged him, pleaded with him, but he was beyond reason. He grabbed the newborn by her twisted leg and drove the blade into her tiny chest, again and again, until the child's feeble cries were silenced forever. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the deaf child's body went limp, the stillborn first child Kumala suddenly, miraculously, drew a sharp breath. Her face, blue and pale, flushed pink. Her tiny lungs filled with air, and she let out a healthy, powerful wail that seemed to shake the very walls. Zeman's madness receded, replaced by a delirious joy. He had his heir, his perfect, healthy child. He ordered his servant Sukir to spread the word throughout the village. Zeman had a daughter, an heir, a continuation of his precious bloodline. But Sulastri knew the truth. She knew what she had done. She knew what she owed. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her bones, that the devil would not be denied his due. The years that followed were a study in cruelty and neglect. Kumala grew, but something was wrong. By age 3, she still couldn't walk properly. Her movements were clumsy and uncoordinated, and she showed signs of developmental delays that the village gossips whispered about behind closed doors. It didn't help that Zeman, reminded of his own childhood struggles, grew increasingly vicious toward the child. He saw in her weakness the same vulnerability he had despised in himself, and he punished her for it. He locked her in the storage room. He beat her. He screamed at her for the smallest offenses. And through it all, Sulastri stood by and watched, saying nothing, doing nothing, trapped between her loyalty to her husband and her guilt over the monstrous bargain that had given her this child. Only Kolsum showed Kumala any kindness. The servant woman had raised the girl from infancy, and she loved her with a fierce, protective love that no amount of abuse could diminish. She would sneak into Kumala's room at night to apply medicine to her wounds, to whisper words of comfort, to tell her that she was loved. On the night of Kumala's 8th birthday, Kulsum brought her a special gift, a handmade doll, crafted with love and care. Kumala clutched it to her chest like a lifeline, tears streaming down her face as she thanked the only person who had ever shown her genuine affection. But that night, as the clock struck midnight and Kumala drifted into an uneasy sleep, she heard something that made her eyes snap open. A whisper. Her name, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Kumala! Kumala! Terrified, she watched as the door of her wardrobe creaked open by itself, and from the darkness within, a figure emerged. A girl, her age, wearing clothes identical to Kumala's. But this girl's face was wrong. Half her head was bald, her skin was pale as death, and her eyes held an ancient, malevolent intelligence. "Who are you?" Kumala managed to whisper. The girl smiled, revealing teeth that were slightly too sharp. "I'm Suma," she said. "I'm your twin sister." Kumala stared, unable to process what she was seeing. She had no sister. She had never had a sister. Her parents had never mentioned. "They killed me," Suma continued, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Our mother and father. They killed me because I was ugly, because I was weak. They didn't love me, and they don't love you. But I love you, Kumala. I'll always love you. We're sisters. Sisters protect each other." And then, before Kumala could react, Suma reached out and gently stroked her hair. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "We're going to be best friends. From now on, the day belongs to you, and the night belongs to me." What followed was a reign of terror that the village would never forget. Kumala, possessed by Suma's vengeful spirit, began to change. By day, she remained the same awkward, gentle child. But by night, she transformed into something else entirely. Her body straightened, her movements became fluid and predatory, and her eyes gleamed with malice that belonged to something far older and darker than any child. The first to feel her wrath were the village boys who had tormented her. They had mocked her limp, thrown stones at her, smeared mud on her face, and chased her away from their games with cruel laughter. They thought she was an easy target, a pathetic, disabled girl who couldn't fight back. They were wrong. One by one, the boys began to disappear. First Triss, who had been unlucky enough to encounter Suma in the cornfield. Then the others, who were lured from their homes by whispers in the night, by the promise of games and adventure, only to find themselves face to face with a monster in the shape of a girl. The village was thrown into chaos. Parents kept their children locked indoors after sunset, nailing windows shut and barring doors. No one dared to venture out after dark. No one, that is, except Zeman. Zeman was a proud, stubborn man, and he refused to believe that his own daughter could be capable of such atrocities. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, even when Salastri finally broke down and confessed everything, the bargain with Tukina, the twins, the murder of the second child, he still clung to his denial. But denial, as he would learn, could only protect him for so long. The horror finally came to a head on the night of Kumala's 10th birthday, the night that Tukina had warned about, the night when the devil would come to claim his daughter. By now, Kulsum had fled. Kumala, in a rare moment of clarity and love, had warned her to leave, knowing that whatever was about to happen would consume everyone she cared about. The loyal servant took her son Sabda and disappeared into the night, carrying with her the knowledge of what had really happened in that cursed house. Zeman, meanwhile, had sought out a traditional healer, a man who practiced ancient arts and knew something of the supernatural. This healer, possessed briefly by a spirit himself, revealed the terrible truth to Zeman. His daughter was already lost. The only way to stop Suma would be to stab Kumala in the heart, but precisely in the right side, where Suma's evil heart had relocated within the girl's body. Armed with this knowledge and a sacred knife, Zeman returned home to face his daughter. But he was too late. The house was a slaughterhouse when Zeman arrived. Sukir, his loyal servant, hung from the ceiling with his throat cut, and in the master bedroom, Salastri lay in a pool of her own blood, her body torn apart by something that had once called her mother. Zeman's knees buckled. He fell to the floor, sobbing, his pride and arrogance stripped away in an instant. All his cruelty, all his obsession with perfection, all his abuse of an innocent child, it had all led to this. His wife was dead. His servant was dead. And somewhere in this house, his daughter waited with the spirit of the child he had murdered. He found her in the cornfield. Kumala stood among the tall stalks, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes gleaming with that terrible ancient malice. But when she saw her father approaching with the knife, something changed. For a brief moment, Kumala surfaced her true self, the innocent child who had only ever wanted to be loved. "Father," she whispered, tears streaming down her face.
He just shattered the world record, but he refused to let go.
Simon hesitated. For the first time in his life, he saw his daughter clearly not as a disappointment, not as a reflection of his own weakness, but as a victim of his cruelty. He had failed her. He had failed both his daughters. And now he was about to kill her because he couldn't live with the consequences of his own sins. Before he could act, Suma took control again. She laughed, a sound that echoed across the field like breaking glass. "You stabbed me in the wrong place," she hissed. "My heart is on the right side. Yours, though." The attack was swift and brutal. Suma threw herself at Simon with inhuman strength, driving the knife deep into his eye sockets, leaving him to die in the dirt where he had once abandoned his second daughter. When the villagers finally found the bodies the next morning, Sukir hanging, Silastri torn apart, Zeman bound and mutilated in the cornfield, they knew that something unspeakable had been unleashed upon their community, and they knew too that it had not been finished. Kumala was never found. Some say she died that night, her body consumed by the evil that had possessed her. Others claim she still roams the region, a creature neither fully alive nor fully dead, hunting those who harm children, extracting vengeance for every tear shed by the innocent. To this day, the people of Semarang do not venture out after dark. They warn their children to stay indoors when the sun goes down, to beware of the girl with half a head, to never follow voices that call their names from the darkness, because Suma is still out there, waiting. And that, my friends, is the story of Kumala and Suma, the twin sisters, born of the same mother, but destined for different worlds. It's a story about the evil that men do, the bargains they make in desperation, and the price that must be paid when they try to cheat the devil himself. It's also a story about love, the twisted love of a mother who would sell her soul for a child, the toxic love of a father who could only see perfection, and the fierce, protective love of a servant woman who was the only one who truly cared. But most of all, it's a story about consequences. Every action has a reaction, every sin leaves a mark, and sometimes the ghosts we create come back to haunt us in ways we could never imagine. If this story chilled you, if it made you look over your shoulder or hesitate before turning off the lights, then I've done my job. These are the stories that remind us that the line between our world and something darker is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes all it takes is one desperate wish, one foolish bargain to tear that line wide open. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into darkness. If this tale left its mark on you, consider subscribing. There are countless other stories waiting in the shadows, and I'd hate for you to face them alone. And if you have thoughts, feelings, or your own experiences with the unexplained, share them in the comments. Sometimes the best way to keep the darkness at bay is to face it together. Until next time, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and never ever follow a voice that calls your name from the cornfield. Sweet dreams.